As you can see here, I'm using a fine detail brush dipped in soap to apply masking fluid to the paper. The soap creates a protective layer on the bristles, which prevents the masking fluid from drying and damaging the brush. This step is essential to keep the brush in good condition. The masking fluid helps me preserve the white areas in my painting by protecting them from the watercolor washes later on. After allowing the masking fluid to dry completely, I begin my painting process. Using a large flat brush, I gently apply a clean layer of water over the entire sheet of paper. This step ensures the surface is evenly damp, preparing it for the soft, blended washes that will follow. While the paper is still wet, I begin applying the first layer of paint. Here, I'm using Naples yellow to create the warm, sunlit tones of the landscape. Building on the base layer of Naples yellow, I now mix in olive green to add variation to the foreground. This combination creates a naturally colored grass background. I carefully apply the paint, letting the wet paper help blend the colors seamlessly. The wet and wet technique allows the paint to flow naturally, blending softly into the paper. To add more depth and variation, I mix yellow ochre with John Brilliant to create soft, light orange hues. These warm tones help suggest sunlit grasses and shrubs in the midground, adding a natural vibrancy to the scene. While the paper was still damp, I took the opportunity to work on the background. I use a mix of opera pink, violet, and a touch of verdite blue to create a soft purple hue. By adjusting the ratio of these colors, I achieve a seamless transition from darker to lighter tones, adding depth to the scene. The wet surface helps the colors blend naturally, creating a gentle and atmospheric gradient in the background. I blend the purple mixture from the background with the warm yellow and green tones from the earlier layers to paint the shrubs near the horizon line. This approach creates a smooth and seamless transition between the distant background and the foreground, helping the composition feel cohesive. Now I begin working on the trees in the middle ground. I mix yellow ochre, turquoise blue, and a touch of violet to create a slightly muted yellow tone. This combination gives the foliage a natural and rich appearance. When painting trees that are farther away or in shaded areas, it's important to incorporate cooler tones into your mixture. Here, I've added Prussian blue to the previous yellow and green shades to create a deeper, cooler tone. This helps to define the shaded foliage and adds depth and contrast to the scene, separating the distant trees from the brighter foreground elements. I continue working on the other trees, layering the colors from light to dark. If you want the trees to appear brighter and more vibrant, remember to add more yellow tones to your mixture. For darker areas or shadows, incorporate more green instead. Avoid using black as it can overpower the painting and take away its vibrancy. Step by step, with patience and precision, I add darker tones to the trees, layering them over the lighter colors from earlier. This gradual process builds depth and contrast, enhancing the three-dimensional quality of the foliage. Each layer adds richness and detail, making the trees feel more dynamic and lifelike. It's important to take your time with this step to maintain balance and harmony across the entire scene. Note that, add a darker version of the previous layer by adding less water, or you can add a little cool tone to reduce the saturation of the color. Using a flat brush dipped in clean water, I re-wet the surface before applying color, making sure to use minimal water to keep the paper just slightly damp. I then add a bit more detail to the trees near the horizon. It's important to keep these details subtle and avoid over-defining them, as too much detail here can reduce the sense of depth in the painting. Ensuring the focus remains on the foreground elements. I return to working on the vegetation in the foreground. As usual, I begin by lightly wetting the paper to ensure soft edges when applying color. Using a mix of violet, opera pink, and ultramarine blue, I layer it over the existing pale yellow-green base. This glazing technique helps to suggest areas of shadow and adds subtle depth to the vegetation. By building up layers gradually, I create a sense of dimension and harmony in the scene, while keeping the transitions smooth and natural. I add a touch of yellow ochre to the green mixture to enhance the distant details. This subtle addition helps to bring out warm accents in the background vegetation, adding depth and richness to the scene. Ensure the composition feels balanced while keeping the details understated to maintain the focus on the foreground. Using a mixture of yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, and a touch of vermilion, I carefully apply color to define the pathway. The warm tones create a sense of sunlight hitting the path, guiding the viewer's eye through the scene and adding depth. I'm using violet to paint the shadows on the dirt path here. With a fine brush, I carefully add shading along the pathway to suggest areas of shadow and depth. It helps enhance the three-dimensional quality of the scene, making the path feel more natural as it winds through the landscape. The cool tone of violet contrasts softly with the warmer dirt tones, keeping the composition balanced. I gently rub off the dried masking fluid with my finger to reveal the untouched white areas underneath. These whites suggest the presence of delicate flowers scattered across the landscape. This simple yet effective technique adds brightness and fine detail, enhancing the depth and realism of the scene while keeping the highlights fresh and vibrant. I'm using a fine detail brush and a mix of light red and Prussian blue to carefully add both branches and tree trunks. These strokes define the structure of the trees, giving them depth and realism. To enhance the natural look, let's add some yellow to the tree trunk. This adds a warm glow and ties the trunk seamlessly with the surrounding foliage. These small details really bring the painting to life. It seems like the trees still look a bit sparse, so I decided to add another layer of foliage to make them more vibrant and give them greater depth. Following the same process as in the earlier steps, I'm using similar colors from the previous layers but in a darker tone for this stage. By layering darker shades carefully, the foliage gains dimension and blends seamlessly with the overall scene, creating a more natural and lively effect. Now, for the closest flowers in the foreground, I'm painting them with a soft mix of violet and a touch of cobalt blue. This combination adds a gentle yet vibrant tone, making the flowers stand out while still blending beautifully with the overall color scheme. Using Naples yellow and a fine detail brush, I carefully paint over the white spaces preserved by the masking fluid. These strokes bring the daisies in the foreground to life, scattered beautifully across the field. The soft yellow tones suggest sunlight hitting the flowers, adding warmth and vibrancy to the scene. In this final step, we should take a moment to slow down and step back to view the painting in its entirety. This allows us to assess the overall composition, including the foreground, middle ground, and background, before adding the finishing touches. Using a small brush, I carefully enhance each area of the painting by introducing intricate textures and delicate strokes. In the foreground, I emphasize the texture of the dirt path, grass, and scattered flowers to bring energy and realism. In the middle ground, I refine the tree branches and foliage to create depth and connection. For the background, I add subtle variations to suggest distant details without overpowering the scene. By layering these final touches across all areas, I add richness and harmony to the composition, ensuring that every part of the painting contributes to a cohesive and balanced whole. With the painting now complete, I carefully remove the masking tape from all four edges of the paper. This reveals clean, crisp borders that beautifully frame the artwork. It's always such a rewarding moment to see the finished piece come to life. Thank you so much for joining me on this watercolor journey. I hope you enjoyed watching the process and learned something new along the way. If you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content like this. I'd love to hear your thoughts or any questions you have in the comments below. Until next time, happy painting and take care.